Let's look at the book of Acts, chapter 10, verse 9. The next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. And he became hungry and wanted something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance and saw the heavens opened and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. Now, Peter was inwardly perplexed as what the vision he'd seen might mean. Behold, the men who were sent by Cornelius, having made an inquiry for Simon's house, stood at the gate and called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was lodging there. And while Peter was pondering the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Behold, 3 men are looking for you. Rise and go down and accompany them without hesitation, for I have sent them." Now let's skip down to verse 28. He travels with them, and then he says to them, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or visit anyone of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. I asked then why you sent for me." Peter refers to his vision when he refers to his relationship with Cornelius and them. He refers to his vision as the reason that he went forth, which is interesting because his vision had nothing to do with people. It had to do with animals. It had to do with the diet. He was hungry and praying, and God said, "You can eat anything, kill and eat." Peter didn't walk away with the revelation of dietary change. He walked away with a spiritual understanding of the physical world. At this point, he's an observant Jew, right? He had never touched anything unclean. He had eaten according to what God had prescribed. But he has the revelation and the understanding at this point that food is a metaphor for worship. Everything physical becomes a metaphor for things spiritual. He recognizes that what God was doing when he laid out objections and rules for the Israelites not to eat was delineating them from every other nation and every other people. That God set up a litany of rules, that if you observe those rules and the behavior of those rules, you would recognize a Jew right away. You'd be able to saw it and say that's only comes from one place, the Jewish faith. And the thing about that is it not only showed who they were to other people, it reinforced who God was to them and their children over and over and over. And even when their hearts would begin to go astray, their habits wouldn't. There's certain times, there's a benefit to passing religion on to your kids, even if the heart of it is absent. There's still the benefit of passing an institution on to your children, because at some point they may have something to call on later in the future. There's people whose parents in the Bible were not observant Jews with their heart, but the habits that they instilled in them created the room for them to become prophets, created the room for them to know God, created the room for Israel to repent and come back. And so it's important that we not only protect the relationships, but it's important that we don't all dissolve and do home churches and say, well, I'm not for formal. It's important that we have institutions to pass down to our children and our children's children. So even when our hearts are astray, we have some kind of thing, the Eucharist, some kind of thing that they can call upon when they begin to get a glimmer of the God that we said we served, and they go back to him in truth and sincerity. So Peter refers to the vision of food when he talks about people, and what he has is this insight that now God is expanding his gospel to all people, that this delineation that was spiritual in nature and had physical ramifications is no more when it comes to food. And it's interesting because the more that we look in the Bible, the more that we see God using metaphors with food. He uses a metaphor for spirituality. We see that Jesus constantly refers to himself as the bread of life. We see that Jesus says, "Eat of my body and drink of my blood." We see that Jesus is constantly talking about the leaven or the yeast of the Pharisees and the kingdom of God being like leaven or yeast. And he's constantly referring to things in terms of farming and in terms of food. And what I begin to realize in studying is that how we interact with the material world is a reflection of how we view spiritual things. You understand that? How we interact. You know, the biggest thing that's problematic is when you tithe but don't understand why you're tithing. When you begin to tithe, but you do it because your pastor said so, instead of understanding the covenant relationship that you have with God when it comes to your finances. What's bad is when you begin to fast because your pastor said to fast, but you have zero understanding why you're fasting or what it means about your reflection upon abstaining from food, with what you're saying about your spiritual beliefs. Everything that we do, it signifies, everything that we do in this realm, this physical realm, this tangible realm, signifies what we believe and who we are spiritually. So when the Israelites abstained from eating certain foods, God had given them habits that they would no longer require to know Him, but it was a reminder of Him that we now have etched on our hearts. This is important because it's going to lead to fasting. Let's look at Daniel. Let's start with chapter 1. And so when we begin to study fasting, one of the most common things and what we think about it, and there's a lot that's happened when I fasted. A lot has happened when I fasted. I've seen miracles. I've seen so much breakthrough when I fasted. And I used to think that it was simply a matter of crucifying the flesh. I thought it was simply a matter of crucifying the flesh. But it's not simply a matter of crucifying the flesh. That's part of it. But it runs much, much deeper than that. And so when I began to gain this insight, I realized that God has called us to a lifelong fast. Let me explain why. We talk about the book of Daniel, right? We refer to the Daniel's fast. How many of you did the Daniel's fast or know the Daniel's fast, right? Oh, a lot less of you than I thought. Okay. So the Daniel's fast is something that a lot of churches tend to do every January. We've done it. Like you go the whole month and you eat vegetables only. You abstain from sugar. You abstain from certain things. And we call that the Daniel's fast. And everybody does it, and it's corporate. And the reality is, as good as that is, that's not what the Daniel's fast is about. The Daniel's fast is not about eating vegetables. It's not even about denying your palate. That's not at all, when you read the book of Daniel, what it's about. When you begin to get insight into the book of Daniel, you get insight into fasting in general, and you get insight into what moves God. Let's look. Is it, Mom? Feels quiet in here. I already had 5 walkouts. In the 3rd year of the reign of Mr. J, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Mr. J, king of Judah, into his hand, and some of the vessels of the house of God. Remember that. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. He brought the vessels of God to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Mr. A, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding and learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned to them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, and it lists other people. So among these were Daniel, who this book is about. It's about his vision. It's about his experience in the lion's den. We all see that growing up as a kid. And then some of us know what a Daniel's fast is, which he refers to, okay? So Daniel gets invited to participate in the king's court. He gets treated like royalty. He gets the education and language, and he gets all the benefits. Even though he's in exile, he gets the benefits of being attached to the king. What we'll see is that eventually Daniel becomes 3rd in line for the kingship. There's an interesting component to this. So Daniel gets the benefits of being royalty. He's treated, he gets an education, he has access to the finest foods, he has access to fine wine, he has access to the king's court. But let's keep reading. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. This is interesting because we never see a parameter where God tells Daniel not to eat of the king's food. So immediately we're introduced to the situation, and Daniel pulls himself away from the king's court, says, I'm not going to defile myself with food. I'll stay in this position. I'll learn your language. I'll advise the king. I'll interpret dreams. I'll be in this position of power. I'll even accept that being 3rd in line to the kingship, but I will not eat of the food. I will not defile myself. And we tend to think of that in terms of just fasting. Like, oh, he was just fasting. But the reality is if you look in Daniel chapter 10, when he goes on another fast, he abstains from the food, he abstains from the wine, and he abstains from the lotion. We never talk about the lotion. We never say, y'all got to be ashy for 30 days come January. The interesting thing about the lotion, the interesting thing about the food, the interesting thing about the wine is the vessels that they were carried in. These vessels belong to the house of God. the king comes and places him in the land of his gods. Daniel recognizes immediately that was meant for the house of God is now being used for a house of flesh, for a house of idols. It's not about the food, it's about his rejection of being adopted into a house of idolatry. Daniel had no problem drinking wine, no problem eating cheese, no problem eating food, no problem putting on lotion. What he had a problem with is the vessels that they were carried in. What this shows me is that we tend to look at things, right? We do a list of things. Show me your faith, I'll show you my works. There's people that look at that scripture in James and they'll just pull out a checklist of things that they do. And the things that Daniel did didn't matter. What mattered immediately is that Daniel, even though he was invited to stand by the king, even though he was invited to eat, even though he was invited to drink, even though he was invited to a place of tremendous power, said, I'll accept the place of influence, but I'll reject the pleasures that come with it. I used this example earlier. My mom has a relationship with the president, and it's cost her a lot. You know, he's a very divisive president in many regards, especially in the faith community. And my mom never asked to be in this position of influence, but she's there nonetheless. And I've seen a lot of people, I've had the opportunity to be by her side, and I've seen a lot of people who also have that access. Not quite the same position, but they have the access. And I've seen how they use it and manipulate it for their own good. And they manipulate it to raise money. And they begin to build their file off of it. And they begin to network. And they begin to use access to the king's court. And they begin to drink of the wine and eat of the food and put on the lotion of the king. Not realizing that the vessels that they're getting fat from were meant for the people of God. And it's an amazing thing to sit there and watch as my mother enters the palace, speaks to the king but refuses his wine, speaks to the king but refuses his food, understands that the vessels are there, that she's not there to fill her belly. She's there to influence generations. She's not there to gain off the back of other believers. She's there to get those vessels back and restore them to their rightful place in the house of God. She doesn't walk according to the kingship of this land. She says the president of the United States, the president of anywhere, that's great. All my responsibility is to the house of God, and I won't leave this place until I restore those vessels to where they belong. Had Daniel just fasted to fast, it would have been meaningless. What he immediately signaled to God is first and foremost your will. You still care about Israel. We might be in exile. We might be in this condition. We might be watching another king's gods take our idols, and they might be drinking wine from the vessels that you intended for worship. But I know your intent, and your intent still stands. And so God, yes, I'll stand in this place of influence, but I'm not going to enjoy that which is idolatrous. I said I've seen celebrity pastors or pastors to celebrities, and sometimes you go, wait a minute, like who's influencing whom here? You know, you go, which one, like what's going on? Like if that's my flock, and if they're reflecting Christ in that way, I think I'm doing a bad job, you know? And I've seen it over and over. Human beings are human beings. And the moment that we get in a position of power, the moment that we can ascertain something, we confuse God's intent and his benefit and pleasure with our own will and intent. And it's easy to get into a position of influence, a position of power, and forget which vessels they belong to. Forget which God the vessels belong to. It's easy to start drinking the wine and eating the food and putting on the lotion and thinking that it's part of the plan of God, when God's plan was only for you to be in a position of influence and not for you to benefit off the backs of those who are in captivity. So Daniel's heard not because of his actions. His actions reflect his heart. His actions reflect a desire to connect to his God. Later it says that God did not forget him, and God did not forget him because Daniel did not forget God. And he was in a circumstance that it would have been easy to. And let me tell you, all of us are Daniels in this land, every single one of us. All of us have access to different courts. All of us are in places that they might refer to our God. They might look a little bit like our God. We might even see vessels that resemble the places of worship that we were at, but they are not serving our God, and they are not meant to feed our bellies. They are meant to be restored to the house of God and to a right order of God. And so when you begin to benefit off the things that God says shouldn't be here in the first place, you are denying the work and ultimately the will of God And so you can fast all you want at that point, but God's not going to hear you. Unlike Daniel, who Gabriel comes down and says, on day one I heard you and had an answer. You were heard on day one, and I always thought that's because he fasted, Mom. I always thought it's because he went 3 weeks without sugar. It's not that. It's the moment that you hit your knees and starve your body and begin to pray, and your heart is oriented toward the will of God. It's a screaming reminder to the heavens that God has to move, not even for your sake, but for the sake of his will in the earth. He says, get out of the way. I have an answer right now. Gabriel, go. Michael, go. Fight who you got to fight. Fight the Prince of Persia. Deliver whatever message you got to deliver, because this person cares about what pleases me in the earth.